Hi, I'm Jim Heavey from Wood Magazine. There's something about a dovetail that just says craftsmanship. They're iconic examples of both artistry and precision. Now, hand-cut dovetails take patience and practice, but unfortunately most woodworkers don't have a lot of the patience part of that. But you can cut perfect, beautiful dovetails using a router and a dovetail jig like this, and the results are consistent and gratifying. And that's the reason I've chosen dovetail jigs as part 3 of my 4-part series on routing for the woodworking shows. Now let's take a look at the 2 different types of dovetails. Now there are 2 types of dovetails. There's the through dovetail and the half blind. In the through dovetail, the pin board is attached to the tail board like this. And when this joint is assembled, you can see both the tails and the pins, both from the front and the side. And I do believe that a joint like that is probably better suited to projects where you really want to show the joinery. In this case, we have the half blind. And when I join the tail board here to the pin board, and that's assembled, you don't see the joinery at all. You only see the beauty part of the project from the front, and it's when you open that drawer, you see the joinery. And I do believe in many cases that this is more appropriate for those projects where you want to highlight the design or maybe the grain of the wood in the front. Now this dovetail jig will both do through dovetails and half blind, but I'm going to only show you how to do half blind, and here's the reason why. So when cutting the through dovetail, I'm going to use this jig. I'm going to start by doing the tail board, and I'm going to use this side of the jig. And the template guide is the 3/4 inch template guide. And the bit we'll use is a dovetail bit. Now the template guide is going to control that bit in and out of each one of these little fingers. And when it does that, it's going to cut these tails. So that's the first one. Then we reverse the template to do the pin board. And cutting these pins now means a couple of things. I'm using the other side of the template. I'm using a different template guide. This is the 5/8 template guide. And with that, we use a straight bit. And again, we're going to go in and out of each one of those little fingers, and they will ultimately create the pin board. The joint itself, once you get the concept, is really not that hard to do. The drawback comes when you have to adjust it to make it a little bit tighter or looser. And the issue there is that you have to remember that you may have to change bits and/or template guides to do that, which can be a challenge. So most of the time we recommend people have 2 routers. But that's how to do the through dovetail. Here's how you do the half blind. Now doing half blinds in this jig is actually really easy. What we'll do is we'll take the pin board here, and that goes on the top of this jig, like so. The tail board now goes in front of the jig, like this. And when these are aligned, I'm using just a single template guide, like this one. And I'm using the dovetail bit here, so that every time this bit, using the template guide, goes in and out of the templates, it's cutting the tails and the pins at the same time. It's much easier to understand, and that's the reason I like doing half blinds first. This is the least intuitive jig you'll ever use. Think about a bit spinning this way, creating radiuses every place, and yet when we're done with the joint itself has nice sharp edges. It doesn't compute. So once you've learned how to use this jig and this half blind configuration, I think it's easier to go to the through dovetail later. It'll make a little bit more sense. But again, since I like this joint more often, I think teaching it is much simpler. This is the way we're going to go. So let me show you how to set up this jig and all of the other things that go with it, one step at a time. So this is the jig I'll be using. to be honest, it represents the majority of most commercial jigs that are out there. They all come with the templates. This is the half-blind template, which I put on here for this presentation. They also come with the through dovetail template. Next, they come with the template guide. This is it here. And what's important about this is that it fits exactly in that template. There is no side play on this at all. And that's why it's important to use their template guide and maybe not one that you have that doesn't fit quite as well. Because when you think about it, when this goes in and out of each one of these little fingers, and it controls the direction of the bit that's in there, if there's a little wobble in there, the bit's not cutting in the same place with each finger. And the tolerances are too tight on a dovetail joint to put up with that. So using their template guide and their bits seems to work really well. But now the template guide itself relies on the fact that it's sitting in the middle of that router base and centered over the collet. Here's what I'm talking about. When you put a template guide in a router, and the bit, of course, runs inside here, like this. This template guide is centered in this base, but if the base itself isn't quite centered over the middle of the collet that's here, the entire system is off just a bit. And the way it can get off, a couple of different ways, I guess. The first is almost all the manufacturers, when they send these out, the base is really right in line with the center of the collet. But maybe you're one of the unlucky people that got one that's not. Or it was perfect before you took the base off to put a circle cutting jig or to invert it in a router table. And when you put the base back on again, maybe it's not quite perfect. And it's exceptionally annoying because you've done everything you're supposed to do with the dovetail jig and yet those joints don't really fit. There is a solution to that, and the manufacturers have already come up with one. The router bit manufacturers have. In the kit with your router when you first got it, you may have found a little metal piece like this and possibly a little cone. This has a 1/2 inch diameter edge, and this is 1/4 inch, and they respond to the collet sizes that you'd be using. So this would be a 1/4 inch collet, this would be 1/2. And the idea is this fits inside that cone, and the cone then allows you to center that base on the collet. But I found this is one that Bosch put in their routers. Same concept here. It's got its own cone built into it. This is the 1/2 inch collet and this is the 1/4. So I've got a 1/4 inch collet in my router right now, and I'm going to use a 1/4 inch template guide to be able to align this, or at least check that alignment. So if I put the template guide in here, like so, and I bring my collet down a little bit closer. When I put this centering pin in, it's going to go right through the middle of that 1/4 inch template guide and drop in the middle of that collet. And you'll notice on here, there's a small little flare on here, and that should be centered over that hole. Kind of tells me when everything's lined up. So this should drop right in like that. So it means that my base now is centered over the middle of that collet, and I'm kind of good to go. But let me see if I can kind of trap this a little bit so that maybe this is what you see when you put yours in. So it's kind of stuck on the top here. And so if that's the case, leave it where it is. Loosen the 3 or 4 screws in the base of your router. Tap this base for a second, and you'll notice it drops in. And leaving the base where it is, retighten those screws. So what really happened was the center of this template guide is centered over the collet now, and that's why the centering pin drops right in there. You probably will never have to do it again unless you take the base off again for your router table or some accessory that you put on the bottom here. But it's a good idea to check them first. It's one of the things that you can eliminate before you go to the template and use the jig, and make sure that your pieces are going to fit nicely because you stopped a potential problem here right away. So now let's talk a little bit about laying out the box and how the pieces go and how we mark them before we go to the jig. So here's my stock. I'm using some red oak. What I'm going to do is lay this out in the way that they would appear on the drawer. So what we've got is the pin board in the front and the back, and the tails on the side. So I just kind of lay them out in the order that I want them. And then now, more importantly, I'm going to look at each one of these faces and see which one I like the best, which grain line or which coloration looks about the best. And I'll lay them out that way so that each one of these has exactly what I'm looking for, like that. So I know right away that that's the way that this is going to appear. So my nicest sides are on the outside. Because all of these jigs work the same, where the nice side is hidden from the jig, you're always routing this from the back side of those. I'll take each one of those like this and lay them face down. So that's the side I normally would not be routing. And to make sure that I route the back edge, which is what I want, I'm just going to take a piece of chalk and I'm going to put a mark on each one of these. Because when I put it on the jig, this pin board that goes on the top, I want to see the X, which means that the good side is in the correct spot. And on the tail boards, on the face, I want to see the X. That means that's in the correct spot. And I do this because sometimes, especially if you're going to make 4 or 5 of these drawers at one time, you have a lot of pieces, a lot of moving parts, and it's really easy to make a mistake and pick up the wrong one. Secondly, I'm going to take that same piece of chalk, and on the corners here, I'm just going to mark A and B and C and D. That will allow me, when I'm doing this, to make sure that the A side goes to this edge and the D side goes to this edge. And it's because these aren't necessarily perfect mirror images. They're duplicates of each other. So if I do it that way and I try and change these to put them on, they won't line up correctly. So that's why I do that. It makes it a little bit easier. Now the second thing is, drawers, when you make them, the pin board in the front and the back are the size of that drawer. I've got an example here. So this would be the full size we're using is here. The sides of this are also the full depth of that drawer, but we're going to subtract out the amount that's been recessed into the front. Okay? But I'm going to suggest that you, to the front, this one, the pin board and the side, add 3 inches at least to the length of each one of these pieces. Because then I can test these on the jig, I can make my cuts in here, and if it's not quite what I want, if it's too loose or too tight or whatever, I can just cut that off. It's about a 1/2 inch each time, cut it off and redo it until I finally get one that fits exactly the way I like. And then I know that the jig's all set up and I can just do all the rest of them. Then what I can do, once that finished edge has been cut, I can cut the opposite side to this length. It just makes it a lot easier. I can literally measure how much of that side goes into the front, and I can readjust this board, and then it makes the rest of that pretty easy. I've decided to add about 3 inches or so, or suggest that you do, because it gives you 6 attempts at doing this. So you can do one, see if it fits, cut it off, do it again, and you won't be too short. To be honest, if it takes more than 6 attempts, they do sell drawers like this in the size that you're looking for, but I don't think you'll ever need that. So that's the idea. And lastly, I can use these boards then because of the actual boards that I'm going to have in my final project. And I can set them up and be pretty comfortable. If in fact I was using a couple of pieces of sacrificial wood, let's just say this is red oak, so let's just say I had some poplar around 3/4 inch thickness and 1/2 inch thickness, I find that if I do that and I get them just the way I like, very seldom is that board 3/4 uniformly across species and places where you bought it. And it would be so disappointing to find out that the poplar that you used was slightly thicker or thinner than this piece, and now your pieces don't fit together well. So making these a little bit longer is a good idea. Now the jig can handle anything from 1/2 inch all the way up to 1 1/8. So the actual thickness of these can vary a little bit. You can't go below 1/2 inch. But the key is that it's all got to be consistent when you set it up, and using the actual pieces from your project is a great way to set those up. So that's the layout idea. Now it's time to go to the jig and show you how they fit on there and some little tricks about getting the lineup exactly the way you want it. All right, as long as I've got this here, you may notice that this box has been dovetailed at the front. This drawer box has been dovetailed at the front and not in the back. And that's my preferred way to do it. All the stress on a drawer is on the front. The pulling on a drawer that's full or stuck means that you're putting an awful lot of pressure on there. And mechanically, there's no way for that interlocking joint to come apart. You may not even have to glue it if you don't want to. But on the back side, this part really doesn't have much stress to it. So what I've done in this case is I just kind of rabbited these. So that's just a little inset into the bottom edge. I kind of prefer to do that, to be honest, because first, nobody sees the back anyway. And the second thing is, it's really tough to form an entire drawer box with dovetails on all those corners. You're complicating your life a lot unless you really want to with something that doesn't have to be done. So that's why you'll see it look the way that it does. Again, if you decide you want to do it on all four corners, that's just fine. I prefer just to do the fronts on either side. I guess if you put on full extension drawers, you can get it out all the way. People may look in the back, but most people don't do that. I think just in the front is more than enough. So the instruction manual will give you a pretty good idea on most of these jigs as to how to set them up. On this particular one, and I know others as well, have a little bit of an instruction panel on the side on either of these, and that'll help refresh your memory. But if you've forgotten where this is and you're ready to use your jig again, the nice part is you can do what I'm going to suggest you do, and that's right on the jig. This is my jig, and it's not going to have any real resale value when I'm done with it, so I want to mark those up. On the top edge here, it says that the face or the front of that cabinet, which is the pin board, goes on top. On the sides of the cabinet, the tails go here, and I've marked this 1 and 3, and on this side 2 and 4. Actually, what that amounts to is A and C, and B and D, if you remember how we marked that thing. So that's on there as well. And the nice part is, it kind of gives me a little mental jog as to how that works. On the top of this too, I wrote down one last instruction I think is important. It says that the best way to use this jig, and it's specific to this type of jig, is that the pieces that you're putting in there should be in 1 inch plus 1/4 inch increments, meaning 1 1/4, 2 1/4, 3 1/4, and so on. On this particular box, this is 4 1/4. So what I'm getting out of that is the perfect pin on the top and bottom, and then equally spaced tails down the face. So as long as I stay within those parameters, I can always work off the left side of the jig. Now the plans will tell you can work off of both, and you can, but I prefer to work off of one. And because I'm left-handed, I kind of prefer that side anyway. But the point is, if I can keep within those parameters, it works well. And here's an example of if you don't do that, if you go a little bit more than that. On the first one, this, instead of being 4 1/2, is actually 4 5/8. So trying to center this exactly in there, you wind up with just part of a tail at the top and bottom. And I don't think that's a nice look. It has nothing to do with the strength of that joint. It's just not terribly attractive. This is the same piece, and this time trying to move this in there so that I'd get at least a full tail on one and a full pin on the other. And again, the strength of the joint is not affected. The problem with that is, if you're only working off one side, is when I cut the first one, it looks pretty nice, and that's what I'd like. But when I cut the next one, and it's inverted to go over here, I wind up with a tail on the top. So I'll have a pin on one side and a tail on the other, and I don't want that. So if you're planning on going beyond any of the calculations for size that this particular jig calls for, then you'll be working off the left and right. I prefer to stay within that. I'll actually design the openings of a project, or make sure that whenever I make a drawer, it stays within those parameters, and then I can always work off the left. Just works a little bit better for me. So let me grab my material here. And first I'm looking for my A side. That's this one. This particular one is 3/4 of an inch thick, and that goes into the jig and the top edge like this, and underneath that template. To make sure that this template is parallel to the base on one side and the other, if I put a sacrificial board in here, and then I can press down on my template, I can get this even on this side and even on that side. So that's how you set the height of the template to begin with. So this is my material. The X is still facing up here, which is what I want, and the A is on the outside edge, which is also what I want. So now this is the A side, that's the tail, and that goes up against this side of the fence, like so. Now when I go to lay this out, there is a little spacer bar on the side over here. In fact, let me move this and I'll show you what it looks like. It's sitting right here behind this opening. So what that does is it sets the edge of this when I lay this piece out on top. And the goal here is to make sure that the tails first, that's the first one I put in, have about the same distance between the edge of this board and the outside left part of that finger, and on the right side as well. Doesn't have to be exact, but getting it as close as you can will really help. Now if this were sitting back here and out of the way, I can set this up right away. I can slide that a little bit left or a little bit right depending upon where I want it. And as soon as I'm happy with that, I can slide it over till it touches and lock that piece in place. Now if I were working left and right, I would do the same thing with the opposite side here and take this plate and adjust it left and right until I find that edge. Okay? You can kind of see on this side that as this stop is going to hold the tail side, there's an offset built into this edge. And that's what the pin board is going to go into. And I'll show you. So this one's kind of set. When I slide the pin board in here, it runs into that offset, so it's kind of pushed, in this case, to the left a little bit, though you can't really see it. The space that's exposed here is exactly the same space that it's exposed here behind it. So as the router bit comes in and out of each one of these, and I rotate these and put them together, this tail board fits into the pin board correctly. If they were right opposite each other, it would be off. So this is built into that jig. It makes it really easy to set up. Okay, so that's the first part in that. And what we'll do is just make sure that it's nice and smooth in there across the joint. Like this, again, flushed up with the edge of that piece and the top where it's supposed to be. The second part of this is how far this template is either towards me or away from me. There is a small score line in this template, and what that's for is to move your template forward or back until that score line sits directly over the joint between the tail board here and the pin board here. So let me tighten these up now that I've made that adjustment, and that's all set. So we have the tail board in, and we've got the pin board in the top here. So those are locked in. Now the last thing is, I've put my router bit in here. This is a dovetail bit, and it's the only one you need for half-blind dovetails. The template's in and the bit's on. To make the distance of that bit correctly, these jigs have a small little stop at this end. You slide this into that little holder, and when I push this down until it touches that stop, I automatically have the correct depth. So what this has done is it's allowed me to set the amount of material that's cut this way, the depth of the material that's cut this way, and the height of the bit correctly. And all of these are to get you close. In a perfect world, the first time you route it, it turns out perfectly. Buy a lottery ticket. But the idea is, as long as you're really close, now you can make these little adjustments after you've played with this a little bit. Now if you remember too, I told you that the front piece and the side piece should be about 3 inches longer than you actually need them. So what I can do is I can make one pass through here and put it together and see how it fit. And again, if it fits nicely and tightly, I'm golden. I'll finish what I'm doing, but now I know the exact space of that and I can trim the opposite end to match. And I know how much this tail is going into the pins and I can measure that and cut that. So it makes that process really easy. So the whole thing sets up pretty quickly once you do it. And again, if you do it often enough, you'll get good at it. But when you don't do it all the time, it's really nice to have these markings on there to kind of help you. And especially the X that's showing here and the X that's showing here always tells you where you're going. Because when I do the next one, and I take this board out, I'm going to be rotating it this way. So when I slide that in, I have to look for the corresponding piece here to do that. So the whole process is pretty simple. So anyway, that's the idea. We are all set. And it's time to route. Okay, a couple last minute tips before we do this. First thing is I like to make sure that everything's clamped down and nice and tight and assured that the faces here meet. The top edge of that tail and the front of that pin are nice and smooth. As you're normally routing, you're always routing from left to right, and the router bit is turning this way. Well, sometimes, especially on oak, you may get a little bit of tear out down in here. So in this case, what we're going to do, and I do this with all dovetails regardless, I'm going to start on the right side and just let the router make a quick pass across the front. What that does is it leaves a nice clean edge so that when I'm coming in and out of here, I eliminate or greatly reduce the potential for that chip out. Now, remember this is on the inside, so it's not going to show anyway, but it's just nice to do that. Secondly, as that router bit is turning, sometimes the outside edge of this tail gets chipped out. And so what I like to do here is take some material, same thickness as this one, and slide it in behind that edge so that as that bit goes in and out of that spot, any potential chip out is eliminated. So those are the couple of things I'll do first. Again, once I start, I'll route from right to left. It's called a climb route across the front, and then we'll go in and out of each one. So let me get an apron on and let's do this. Okay, so we're all set here, and then we're going to look at each one of these tails and make sure they're nice and round on each side. And if they're squared at that edge, it just means that you didn't kind of round around the corner, and you'll have to do it again. Okay, now for the fit. And there is our fit. So we've got the pins and tails in there, and you can see what that looks like with that fit. Now that you've finished routing that joint and you fit it, you may find that that joint is fitting just a little too loose. And if it is, here's the instructions of making that a little bit tighter. And I put those on the jig because it just kind of helps jar my memory. So if that joint is a little too loose, all you need to do is lower the bit just a little bit out of the router, and that will help tighten that joint up a little bit. If the joint itself was too tight, then raise the bit, and again that will make it a little looser. So these are your two adjustments to adjust a fit of those pins and tails. So now what I'm going to do is let me glue this together. It'll take a little while to set up, and then I want to come back and show you how to clean up all these edges, because as you may notice, This is in just a little bit from the edge, maybe a 32nd or so, maybe not even that. But it's a perfect way to make that dovetail look beautiful when we're done. I'll be back in a minute. Well, the glue is dry on this piece, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about the construction itself. Before this joint is assembled, I need to cut a groove on the inside edges of all four sides. I'll need that to house the bottom. I'm going to suggest that when you do that, take a piece of chalk like this and mark which sides that groove goes on. We all know it goes on the back side, but it may wind up here and it may wind up here, which you'll never get the drawer together. So I like to mark those. Trust me, I've learned this by experience. Second thing is, I want that drawer bottom to come through one of the tails, like you see on the side here. It's because when this drawer is assembled, you won't see the groove. I've got one here. So there's our groove on the inside edges. And it comes through the middle of that tail, and you'll notice when it's assembled, it doesn't show. If, on the other hand, when you're laying out your groove inside, and it winds up coming into one of these pins, that's where you see that small little square on the edge outside. That's a bad thing. So lay these out so that you get that groove on the inside in the middle of one of those tails. Now, following the manufacturer's recommendations on this, which is the 3 1/4, 4 1/4, 5 1/4, and so on, it leaves a full pin on the top and bottom and a tail just up from the bottom. So if that's the case, the groove that's in here is leaving a bottom edge on this that's 3/8 of an inch or so wide. So when the bottom of the drawer goes in, even if it's overloaded, it'll never snap this part out. If you remember, I talked about trying to make pieces that don't quite fit with the layout of the jig. So this was the 4 5/8 one. And again, we found a way on this one to center it, but it wound up with those two little tails on here, which again, I'm not really thrilled about. But the problem is, look at how high that tail is here, which means putting a groove in here wastes an awful lot of the bottom of that drawer. The same is true with the one that we moved a bit to try and get them even. No matter which side of the tail we're trying to use, we're still off on that because this one will do one side, but it won't do the other. So my suggestion, as it was when I started this, is to stay with the manufacturer's recommendations on the size of those sides. You can design your drawer fronts, you can design the openings in there to fit that. It makes everything else a whole lot easier. Okay, now when we look at the face of this, you'll see a couple different things. You'll notice in here that there's small little openings and maybe little chip marks around where those tails and pins meet. Hopefully you can also see that the pin board, the front one, is slightly proud of the side. And although it looks like a problem or a mistake, I really like that. In a perfect world, the tails and the pins are perfect, everything's even, and you don't even have to touch it. But in the real world, there's always something you'll have to do on there, and it's really hard to go after something when there's not a lot of room left to sand. And any chip outs are really tough to take care of. So in this case, I've got just this little variance on the outside edge. And the little trick to fixing this is really simple, and it's exceptionally effective. I'm just going to take a little bit of glue, and it's not going to be much, and using my finger, I'm going to kind of force it into those little openings. Now you can actually see where some of those variances are. Just like that. Now, once they're in there, the glue's going to get sticky after a couple of minutes. And I'm going to put this in the vise, and I'll take my random orbit sander and sand this flush. And again, because the pin board in the front is proud of the side, I've got something to sand. If the tail board were just a little bit too far out, I have to sand the entire thing. So I prefer this over the other. So in some magic way, the sticky glue in there is going to collect sawdust in just the right spots to clean up each one of those little edges and make it look perfect. This is a lot easier than trying to do this perfectly on the dovetail jig, because all you'll do is obsess about something you probably can't change. This is a fact. It's going to happen. This is the way to take care of it. So I think we've got it a little bit sticky right now. Let me put it in the vise. We'll get the random orbit sander and I'll show you how nicely that cleans up. Now you can see how pretty those joints are as they turn out. I've got some relatively coarse sandpaper in here to start with, so I would finish this up with a real fine sandpaper and it'll look perfect. This is just a beautiful way to do this joinery that eliminated all of the excess parts that were sticking out from the front and take away all of those potential problems from the side. Markedly easier to do. This is the way a dovetail should work. That's how it should look. When I first started this segment, I talked about, kind of jokingly, that adding 3 inches to either side of this would give you a good 6 attempts at this, and if you can't do it in 6 attempts, that maybe you need to find an alternative. To be honest, I think you need to be a little bit more patient with yourself. Add that extra and play with this a bit, because it doesn't take long before you get this exactly, and maybe you're getting it in 2. Maybe it's taking 4, but it's okay, because once you get it, every one of those will be exactly the same. That's what's nice about doing something on a dovetail jig as opposed to by hand. It's exceptionally consistent and it's always perfect. So I think you'll find out that this works pretty well. I'm suggesting that I think the beauty in this is worth all of the practice and the effort that went into it. I think you'll be proud of yourself when you open that drawer, and the fact is you'll never make a rabbited joint anymore. You'll never do a corner miter anymore. You'll never do a butt joint anymore. You'll be dovetailing those drawers. So now that you've seen the operation of the dovetail jig, and after a while as you get more comfortable with it, you can learn that you can kind of play with it just a bit. This is what's called a rabbited half-blind dovetail, which is hard enough to say, let alone do. I can't imagine trying to cut one of these by hand. So the idea is that this pin board here actually sticks out over the front of the side. So it provides its own stop when you put it into an opening. Now when I did the oak piece before, I told you that I like that little bit of the face board, the pin board, sticking slightly proud of the sides by about the thickness of a thumbnail. Well, that was because I took this template and I moved it back just a bit. So what it did was it cut slightly deeper into the pin board to allow that piece to go back 1/32 of an inch or so. But if I want to make this nice rabbet, and let's just say it's a 1/4 of an inch rabbet, instead of having this even with the 2 pieces in front like our first setup is, set it back a full 1/4 of an inch. You're still cutting the tails exactly as before, but you're going very deep into the top board. In fact, not just a 1/32 of an inch, but a full 1/4 of an inch. And before it's assembled, I'll take it to the table saw, and using a dado blade, I'll remove these little pins that are sticking up in there. And what I've got with that, when I assemble it, is a half-blind rabbited dovetail. It's just cool. It works really well, and it's just another thing you can do once you start getting comfortable with the dovetail jig.